Hi, and welcome to my presentation. I call it Cash in Hand is a Better Plan. So, a major issue is that in-kind food aid is patently flawed in that it transfers food all around the world, contributing greatly to carbon pollution. But it also leads to certain things like agricultural dumping, where the U.S. sells surpluses of ag commodities in the world at below market value prices, leading to lots of undue competition. Cash transfer programs just inherently cost less money in that you're just sending money. There's no shipping costs involved. The admin costs are much lower. It keeps it keeps buying in country. Commodities are bought, and so supporting the local population, local farmers, and it also just increases the access to humanitarian aid that those living in the most marginalized peripheries experience. Where a cell phone and a signal is much easier to come by than transportation. So the bulk of the research here, it's all secondary research, though much of it was informed through conversations with development agents and experts. I did a literature review of different journal articles, and looking mostly in the last 5 years to kind of have a better, greater temporal context to my thesis. There are 4 different sections I looked at in the research. It was issues with the current international food aid system, a look at cash transfer programs and their efficacy towards development goals, an evaluation of cash transfer versus in-kind food aid, and addressing the hidden impacts within conditionalities of cash transfers. So, to analyze the food system, let's first look at food and the global food chain. In his seminal book, Poverty and Famines, Amartya Sen begins his chapter with this: starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there not being enough food to eat. While the latter can be a cause of the former, it is but one of the many possible causes. He wrote this in 1981. Yet, most of those who I talk to outside the development world to this day don't know this. And in fact, many within the development world don't. They think there's a lack of food, and that's just not true in this world. Looking at U.S. foreign policy, there's also this kind of lack of understanding of how the global food chain works. In Foreign Policies and World Markets, Tim Jostling looks at how the U.S. Farm Bill has been used as his foreign policy tool to manipulate global prices through austere measures or through agricultural dumping, as we've mentioned, the selling of excess surplus goods. And this, creates challenges for low-income farmers who have to compete with U.S. goods in their country. Not to mention, again, the carbon footprint of it all. Last year, food aid is structured the same way then as this kind of farm bill and agricultural dumping, the way we just interpret international food markets and interact with them from the U.S. Last year, USAID shipped 1.6 million metric tons of farm products across the globe, and that cost $2 billion. I mean, and just, again, beyond just the kind of environmental damage, it's such an inherently inefficient way to do this. In their 2009 fiscal reports to Congress, the USDA, USAID, and the GAO all cited how cash transfers are much more efficient and cost-effective and timely options compared to those in their in-kind food aid programs. In their report specifically, USAID found their local and regional procurement, their LRP program, which is one of the closer things that we have to a cash transfer program, only received $15 million of those $2 billion in funding. Despite USAID's own admission within that report that they are 20 to 30 times more cost effective. That means, again, by their own admission, USAID could have saved $600 million last year. $600 million. And they know it. Which begs the question, why in-kind food aid at all? Well, that stems back to the foreign policy tool argument. When Eisenhower signed the Food for Peace Act in 1954, the U.S.'s role as the world's biggest food aid provider began. Title II of this act, which deals specifically with international food aid and funding, states that, one, the goal of the Food for Peace Act is to expand U.S. agricultural export markets. And two, to provide assistance for international populations in need of food. Well, right there we already see how U.S. economic interests are more in line. It's the number one reason for the Food for Peace Act. And that's kind of just funny. The worst part of all this is that, it takes food aid roughly 70 to 100 days to go from the U.S., to be shipped from the U.S., and to actually, be in the hands of the recipient, in the recipient country. 70 to 100 days. How magically inefficient is that? The U.S. has a program, it partners with Puerto Rico, called the Nutritional Assistance Program, and every year they send an electronic grant which is instantly received by Puerto Rico, who can then, that day turn it around and send the first month's beneficiary payments instantly to people's cell phones. First of all, the zero paper trail there is kind of a little beauty to behold as well. Bolsa Familia is another cash transfer program, very popular, very many people have heard of, in Brazil. It's been around for a long time, and some of their numbers are, children in this program are 62% more likely to be in school. And every real, the Brazilian currency, in the program is 3.22 times more likely to increase social welfare than a real that was earned in the labor market. Every 1% increase in Bolsa Familia funding leads to a 1.78% increase, in GDP. While these numbers are encouraging, more long-term research does need to occur. In one study, they found that the short-term effects of CCTs like this one are marvelous. And in the long term, certainly there are, educational factors, educational indicators that are much improved. But do CCTs even alleviate people, conditional cash transfers, even alleviate people out of poverty, out of this intergenerational cycle of poverty? Indicators tracking these long-term types of results need to be placed within cash transfer programs. In evaluating food versus cash transfer, though, a 2014 randomized experiment in Ecuador of Ecuador's food transfer, food voucher, and cash transfer programs found that essentially cash vouchers and cash transfers were neck and neck in terms of the basic, increases caloric intake, food consumption increases in dietary density, decreases in malnourishment, severely malnourished, things like that. They've also found that cash transfers, though, were the cheapest to implement. Not by much, but still were the cheapest to implement, costing $2.99 international cents a transfer, compared to $3.27 for vouchers and $11.46 for food transfers. The authors also found that if Ecuador were to move its food transfer programs into cash transfer, they would be able to increase their aid beneficiaries by 12%. Some other facts are, cash transfer programs in Yemen, Cambodia, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh showed greater food consumption compared to their food transfer counterparts. In Uganda, there was a 3.8% reduction in those severely underweight receiving cash transfers versus food. In Bangladesh, cash transfer recipients showed an increased income of 31.4% versus 27.8% income increase for food transfer recipients. A current professor of economics at Harvard admits in an editorial to Bloomberg that the lack of cash transfer programs has more to do with politics than economics. He also exalts cash transfers as having the greatest gains to welfare, stating, "The big reason poor people are poor is because they don't have enough money, and it shouldn't come as a huge surprise that giving them money is a great way to reduce that problem, considering considerably more cost-effectively than paternalism. So let's abandon the huge welfare bureaucracy and just give money to those who we should help out." One thing to be wary of as well is the conditionality portion of cash transfers. First off, there's no conclusive research that indicates conditionalities placed on cash are what increase social welfare, and many argue it's just the extra cash in hand that allows poor families to afford a better basket of goods. So, particularly affected by these conditionalities are women. Since women are seen as a caregiver, cash transfers usually go to them. And cash transfer indicators that need to be met usually deal with children's nutrition and health and education. So it is then these mothers' jobs to do exactly as the conditionalities say, otherwise they may lose their money and place in the system. Dr. Tara Cookson, a gender-focused development expert, studied women in Peru as part of her doctoral research. She found that their cash transfer program, Juntos, placed undue pressure on already tough low-income mothers. Tough situation low-income mothers. And this also places undue constraints on mothers' time. What's worst is this inherent notion that poor mothers need incentive to be good mothers, and their inability to provide nutrition and education for their children is not somehow a product of their poverty. Ridiculous. So, I find the solutions here to be quite simple, okay? First off, let's make a good base layer, right? Let's, to all these ends, let's first create aid directing committees, comprised equitably of donors and aid-receiving countries. Keyword equitably. and within these create alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that are more equitable as well to developing countries. Now this improved structure, abolish in-kind food aid, get rid of it completely, and replace it with unconditional cash transfers wholeheartedly. Because according to Paul Farmer, I am hungry is a material problem, but when someone else is hungry is a spiritual problem. To that end of this kind of complex, the various angles within which that I've covered here, my public deliverable is going to look something like this one-sheet UN deliverable. Though, obviously the numbers and everything will change, and style will be my own. The idea here is, though, this is a huge complex system, and there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to unravel, unpack. And it makes it easier to have this kind of multi-graphic infographic to kind of show all the different elements and just how inefficient food aid is, and just how much more efficient cash transfers are, and inherent problems there with some quotes, perhaps, to show the qualitative aspect as well as the quantitative aspect to everything that's happening in this debate. The idea behind, again, this as well as making it visually accessible, is going to be aimed at policymakers, but really at anyone, not really policymakers, because then anyone else that it would be aimed at would be to use to encourage policymakers. Anyway, this media savvy world we have today, something like this, between teenagers and even almost retirees in the government, this is an easy way to look at it. So, thank you again for listening to my presentation.